In this talk I'm going to be discussing selection bias, which is one of the three main categories of bias in any epidemiology study. So how do we define selection bias? So you can think of it as an error or a systematic error arising from systematic differences between people who participate in a study and those who were eligible for the study but didn't actually end up in the study. And secondly, we can think of it as another way it can occur is from the inclusion in the study of people who are not actually eligible for the study. And thirdly, a problem that occurs is selective loss of participants prior to the end of data collection. And I'm going to provide you with examples of all of these three sources of selection bias. So it can occur in any study, but it's particularly a problem in case control studies. And this is because by the time that the people are recruited into the study, both the exposure and the health outcome have already occurred. And so both the exposure and the health outcome therefore have the opportunity to influence the selection process in some way. On the other hand, with experimental studies and also with cohort studies, because the health outcomes have not occurred at the time that people actually recruit into the study, they don't have the opportunity to influence participation in the study. Only exposure has occurred. And if you only have exposure, then as I'll show you, it's much more difficult for selection bias to occur. Okay, so let's talk about some examples, some of which will be probably already familiar to you. And so the first one, self-selection bias. And self-selection bias occurs, for example, if you were to permit people to volunteer for a study, say, for example, advertise, put notices up around in the streets asking for people to come forward and participate. Those people who voluntarily come forward are likely to be systematically different in some way, often not in easily definable ways, but they're likely to be different to people who didn't actually come forward. So for that reason, most epidemiology studies use, or very rarely ever use, volunteers, just because of this problem. Another example would be women who undergo mammograms. They're likely to be different from women who don't undergo mammograms. So if we take our study population from the population of women who undertake mammograms, then they're not really necessarily going to be representative of the broader population of women. And thirdly, a third example, people who respond to news media opinion polls, and we're always being bombarded by opportunities to vote for one candidate or another online, and then when we vote, we see what people prefer, the distribution of choices. This is completely unrepresentative of the general pattern of preferences in the population. It's very much selected in terms of people with access to computers, and also people who probably further selected in terms of people who spend a lot of time sitting at their computer, surfing the web and so on. So those are just a few fairly obvious examples of self-selection bias. Then another fairly common form of bias is non-participation bias. So this is something that's always of concern to us when we set out to recruit people, when we select a population sample using maybe some particular procedures, and then we approach people, we invite them to participate, but often some proportion may be unwilling to participate, and we may be able to ask them a few questions, find out why, but very often we can't really be sure why they don't participate. But in any case, we end up with a situation where we're not sure whether the people who agree to participate are really representative of our base population. And what is the difference between those who are willing and those who are unwilling? So that potentially introduces some form of selection bias into our study. But just to say that if we don't have to actually actively go out and recruit people, get informed consent and so on, such as the retrospective cohort study, then selection bias is not likely to be a problem, because those people don't even know that they're in the study. We got access to some database created some time ago. So that's a problem that retrospective cohort studies avoid. And again, this problem is more prevalent, potentially more prevalent anyway, in case control than in cohort studies. Again, because people have well, they know their disease status by this time. People are either cases or controls, and cases or controls may be differently motivated to participate. So we'll come back to this example of case control study and illustrate it a bit further. But let me just say something about selection bias in cross-sectional studies. This is sometimes called incidence prevalence bias. It arises because we in cross-sectional studies we measure prevalence, and so we're more likely to get people with the longer duration disease cases or incurable cases. So not necessarily representative of incident cases of the disease. And of course we're not going to be able to recruit people who moved away because of the effects, say, of local exposures, or people who have died or been cured. So that's the problem in general problem in cross-sectional studies, as opposed to studies which get measures of incidence, and this is in fact a form of selection bias. So as I mentioned, selection bias can be a particular problem in case control studies, and this can occur when the control group is not representative in terms of exposures of the non-case population among which the cases occurred. And here's an example of that. So say, going back to the mammography example I mentioned before, if we obtained our breast cancer cases from mammography clinics, but we obtained our controls from sampling the general population, then the problem is women who undergo mammography are not likely to be on average the same as people in the general population, women in the general population. They I think generally are probably more likely to be of higher socioeconomic status and have all the things that generally accompany that. So what will happen if you used a general population control group? Anything more commonly associated with having mammography will appear to be risk factors in the data analysis, just because it occurs more commonly in the case group than in the control group. So anything associated probably with higher socioeconomic status is likely to appear to be a risk factor in this sort of analysis. So the simple solution in a situation like this is to obtain your controls also from women who underwent mammography but who were not diagnosed with breast cancer. So for my second example, I want to talk about a case control study that I was involved in New Zealand in the 90s. And New Zealand had a major problem with the gastroenteric disease Campylobacteriosis. A lot of people were getting sick. And the incidence rates were going up year by year. So we really wanted to try and track down what were the risk factors. Why was this happening? So we carried out a case control study, obtaining cases from the disease notification system, and we obtained controls using a random digit dialing procedure, calling up people whose prefixes matched the case prefixes, and we tried to match people by age and sex. So the results, the actual results, the thing that came out particularly out of the study was that it appeared that people who ate chicken out at restaurants, they seem to be more at risk. So eating chicken at restaurants seemed to be a risk factor for Campylobacter. So I have to say that I have personally always been suspicious that we overestimated this, and I'll explain my reasons why. So we ended up with a odds ratio of 3.62. I thought it plausible that it had something to do with eating chicken, because we know that Campylobacter gets into chicken, but the fact that this eating chicken at a restaurant stood out so strongly, I was a little suspicious of. And let me try and explain why I think selection bias may have occurred. Because we recruited the controls by phone, it meant that we might be more likely to recruit people who were likely to stay at home. So, and we carried out, in hindsight, I think, too few attempts. I think we only carried out about 3 or 4 attempts, maybe more than that, but not so many in order to try and contact people. And we moved on too quickly, I think, to another number. So I suspect we probably over-selected people who were more likely to spend time at home and less likely to eat out. So the case group may have been just a very normal selection of people with, their eating out habits may have been possibly, reflective of the general population. But I think what we did, we over-recruited people who were more likely to stay at home, and this led to a bias and factors associated with eating out appearing to be risk factors. So it may be, and I made up some data here, that the true relationship might have been more like this. Say, because it's plausible that chicken would be a risk factor, but I thought it less likely than, for example, people cooking their own chicken in barbecues. That's a notorious, people undercooking the chicken, a notorious source of foodborne illness. But restaurants, generally speaking, the people are well trained, and I thought it less likely that this was occurring on the scale suggested by our study results. So this, I thought, might be a more plausible result, and so I suggest that maybe this might have been a more appropriate distribution than the controls. But I just sort of made that up because I don't actually know. But notice that the case distribution stayed exactly the same as in our actual results. That's because we, as investigators, did not determine the case distribution. The cases essentially came to us, or at least their contact details were given to us, and we really we were responsible for the control selection method, and I think we could have done it better in hindsight. But of course you can never actually know, but because there is some truth out there, but we can only infer what it might have been. So I may be wrong, and that may be that there is no selection bias, but I continue to think that we possibly could have persisted longer in attempting to contact appropriate controls. And so the fact that we don't know, we never really know the true relative risk, means we can only really infer what it might have been. And so this is the case in studies. We often hear it's said that results of a study are not valid or biased, and really that's just because of some design feature. The study did not exclude the potential for bias, and so usually we judge studies more on the basis of how a study was designed and carried out, and how it was designed to exclude sources of recognized bias, such as including selection bias, rather than actually proving lack of bias, which is, generally speaking, an impossible thing to do. So really, it's a matter of looking at the potential for bias rather than actual bias. Now I want to mention a bias which has somebody's name attached to it. This is Bergson's bias, named after the statistician Joseph Bergson, who first identified it. And this occurs particularly around hospital-based case control studies, and that's because people in the hospital, whether cases or controls, are likely to have multiple health conditions and a larger set of risk factors than people in the community, which we may be thinking of in terms of as being the base population for the study. So this, using hospital groups, either case or controls, can in various ways lead to invalid relative risk estimates, invalid at least when we're thinking about them in terms of how they can be extrapolated to the population. And the main problem possibly occurs with hospital controls, and that's because hospital controls generally have a larger set of risk factors than people in the community. That's possibly why they're in the hospital. And but the thing is that we're usually thinking in terms of we usually think about the cases in our case control study as being kind of drawn from the community, and therefore we want our control group to represent the community, at least in terms of the non-cases. But the problem is they're probably a selection of the general community, selection with higher rates of smoking and drinking and some other risky behaviours. So that's Bergson's bias, always to be thought about when carrying out a hospital-based case control study. So another form of selection bias can occur in case control studies when the participation rate between cases and controls is different according to exposure status. So and the problem here is that cases may have thought a lot about that. They've got some illness and they've thought a lot about it. Very commonly, people do anyway, and they've remembered things or maybe misremembered, but they may have suspicions about what maybe caused their condition, and they may be ready to and they may be much more willing to participate, particularly if they've got some exposure which they've thought about. And it's difficult to know whether this has really happened, and the key thing is to obtain, as far as possible, high participation rates in both cases and controls. But almost invariably, in my experience, and I think it's a general rule, cases are more willing to participate in case control studies. So there's always a suspicion is that there is some general concern about a particular exposure among the cases, which has made them more willing to participate. So I can illustrate that with this hypothetical case control study. So here we have 200 cases and 200 controls, and so these are the data, and so you can see they're pretty evenly distributed between exposed and unexposed. And if you multiply it all out, of course you get an odds ratio of 1. So in other words, no relationship between the exposure and the disease. However, consider the situation when exposed cases, perhaps there's some sort of general sort of word out there that a certain exposure causes a disease, and then when you try and carry out a case control study to confirm that, or not, as the case may be, you may find people with that particular exposure are more willing to participate than non-exposed cases. So you may get a sort of a distortion, more willingness, assuming that there is some rate of non-participation across all of these cases or controls. So we may, instead of that sort of 100 and 100, we might get more exposed cases. And therefore, because the totals in our study, the totals will remain the same. We recruit 200 of each, 200 cases and 200 controls. But so when we reach our 200, we stop recruiting. But because of the higher participation rate among the exposed cases, we end up with more of them. And then the impact of that, when you calculate out the odds ratio, it gives us an odds ratio of 1.5 as opposed to the null value. So in other words, there's bias away from the null, in the direction of a falsely increased risk. So this is a sort of hypothetical thing, at least, that can happen. So cohort studies also have selection bias, and this often results from loss to follow-up, when people have kind of dropped out of the study for one reason or another. And the problem occurs if at least one of the in at least one of the exposure groups, so it could occur in both, and if there's a different rate of loss to follow-up between those getting the disease and those not getting it. So either those getting the disease or those not getting it are more likely to be lost to follow-up, but it's not the same rate. And this is actually equivalent to a different disease rate in those remaining in the cohort and those lost to follow-up. That's another way of thinking about the same thing. So let's illustrate it. So here we have our hypothetical cohort, and there's no loss to follow-up. This is perfect cohort, no loss to follow-up, and we would obtain a relative risk of 3. However, we carry out the cohort study, and in practice, what we actually get is some loss to follow-up. So in this E+, which is the exposed group, we find there's a 20% loss to follow-up. So you can calculate that out, but you can see that there's 20% lost from there, 20% from there. But in the unexposed group, we get a 10% loss to follow-up. So 1 person out of 10, and so on. So we have a 10% follow-up, resulting in these sort of totals. But if we carry out we calculate the relative risk, the cumulative incidence ratio, really, in this case, we find that the relative risk is exactly the same. So even though we've had loss to follow-up in both groups, and it's not the same in the exposed group and in the unexposed group, it doesn't actually bias our results. In this circumstance, it doesn't actually bias our results. So let's consider a slightly more complicated situation. We start with the same cohort, and this is the full cohort where there was no loss to follow-up. So, but and again we have in our actual cohort, we have the same 10% loss in the unexposed group, E-. But instead of having 20% across the board here, we have 40% loss to follow-up in the people with disease, who have disease and the exposure. And then we only have a 20% here. So it's 20% here, 40% here, and then 10% across the board for the unexposed group. So, but there's a differential loss to follow-up among the exposed in terms of whether people were diseased or not diseased. And when we calculate that out, we get a relative risk of 2.3. So just to illustrate why that happens, there is if we can calculate the cumulative incidence in those who lost to follow-up, which is 6 people, 15 to 9, 6 people, and then we have the total group, 203 people. We can calculate a nearly 3% loss to follow-up. But in those remaining in the cohort, these people who are still in the cohort, the cumulative incidence is 1.13. So basically they have different incidence rates depending on whether they lost to follow-up or not lost to follow-up. And that is what leads to this bias, which causes our relative risk estimate, when we carry out the calculation, to be less than what it would have been if there were no loss to follow-up. So that's the situation. It doesn't matter if the loss to follow-up rate across all the exposed versus all the unexposed is different, but if within either of these groups it could have occurred, if the rate in those who lost to follow-up is different from those who remain in the cohort, then we will have bias introduced, selection bias caused by loss to follow-up. So I think really this is just recapping what I just said, and it applies whether we're in that example I just showed you. We were looking at cumulative incidence ratio, but it would apply even if we're looking at the incidence rate ratio. So what do we do with loss to follow-up? Problem is it can be difficult, usually very difficult, to know the health outcome rate of people who lost to follow-up. So we can't really know whether we had that bias coming in or not, because those people are gone. We didn't collect their health outcome information. So the only way to try and guard against this, at least theoretical possibility, is to achieve high rates of follow-up in both the unexposed and the exposed group when we carry out a cohort study. So another way in which selection bias can occur in cohort studies is when the exposed population that we're looking at in our cohort has been selected in a way that has a different underlying health status from the unexposed or comparison group. And a classic example of this is the so-called healthy worker effect. So the healthy worker effect usually occurs, was usually observed, I should say, in occupational studies. So this study here is looking at cause-specific mortality among white male US crude oil production workers. So we have causes of death here, and then we have standardized mortality ratios. And you can see for all causes, you can see that the standardized mortality ratio is 0.73, and the comparison group here is US white males. That's if you remember how to use the indirect standardization method. And we use incidence rates from a comparison group, often a population comparison group. And so you can see when we compare these crude oil production workers to the general population, they appear to have a lower all-cause mortality rate, and this actually seems to be common across many of the conditions, including diabetes and so on, lung cancer even, suggesting maybe that they smoke less maybe than the general population. So this is a fairly common finding in occupational studies, that particularly when you compare it with the general population, that you get these reduced relative risks below the null value, suggesting some sort of protective effect. So this phenomenon is called the healthy worker effect, and there are two main components. First of all, people who are healthier at the time of employment are more likely to be selected into a job. Employers are more likely to choose such people. And then, so that's the selection in, and then there's the selection out. People, if the job is very demanding, people who are not able to cope with the demands are more likely to leave. And this is particularly the case in occupations involving fairly heavy labour, fairly heavy physical demands. So police, firefighters, military, and so on. Usually they show fairly strong evidence of the healthy worker effect. For the most, in general, if we look at cancers, the effect is usually much less apparent. The reason for that is that the most causes of cancer are not obviously making people less healthy at the time of employment, and they don't really, for the most part, affect their ability to cope with the job. So causes of cancer or cancers are not usually, they may be a little bit affected by the healthy worker effect. For example, people in the workforce may be less likely to smoke, so they may be less likely to have, as in that previous example, they may be less likely to have lung cancer. But they have a reduced rate of all cancers, but to some extent that is influenced by the lower lung cancer rate. So, healthy worker effect, it's a fairly common form of selection bias that's seen in occupational studies. So, going back to the definition of selection bias that came up in an early slide, I mentioned three possible ways in which it could arise. The first one, systematic differences between the characteristics of subjects included and those also eligible who are not included. Self-selection bias and participation bias would be examples of that. Then we have the second situation was from the inclusion in the study of people who were not actually eligible for inclusion. And this would be a situation when we selected controls from outside the case source population. An example of that would be the taking breast cancer cases from the mammography population and controls from the general female population. The third situation, because of selective loss of subjects prior to the end of data collection. So this is loss to follow-up in cohort studies, or incidence prevalence bias in cross-sectional studies, because some people have not, they have died, or they've been cured, or they have not actually reached the time point when the cross-sectional study has been carried out. So, just to sum up, what can we do? There's not a lot that we can do. So for that reason, we really try and design our studies so as to minimize it. We can, to some degree, and we're going to talk about adjustment of results to try and deal with confounding, but it's not likely to fully correct. It may partially take into account, but basically we cannot be confident of eliminating selection bias once it's occurred. So we need to take into account when designing and conducting the study, and there are various things here that we can do. Make sure cases and controls are from the same base population in case control studies. We need to identify all the cases, if we can, of the health outcomes of interest. I mean, in any study, in cohort studies or in case control studies, get high participation rates. That applies to pretty well every epidemiology study. Minimize loss to follow-up in cohort studies. And if possible, do internal comparisons in cohort studies, but as we've discussed, that's not always possible because we often can't discriminate our cohort, particularly if it's a retrospective cohort, in terms of degrees of exposure. So we have to often just compare the whole cohort with some external population, often the general population. So that's my talk on selection bias, and in my next talk I'm going to be dealing with information bias.